being pure of heart. As we've been talking about the Beatitudes, it is again important for us to keep them in context because they build off of each other. As we've mentioned, I think each and every beginning of each and every sermon that we've had through the Beatitudes. Blessed are they who are poor in spirit, blessed are they who mourn, who are meek, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are merciful, and now those who are pure in heart. Blessed are the pure in heart. And we just heard there from Psalm 24, verses 3 through 6, who can approach God? Who can come up to His holy mountain? Who can, inevitably, who can see His face? But those who have clean hands and a pure heart. Pure here in the Greek is the word katharos, which we get the word catharsis and cathartic. And usually we use these terms very loosely, but they inevitably mean to cleanse oneself of poor feelings oftentimes. We do things out of catharsis, or because it helps us, it perceives to be helpful. And it oftentimes has a negative connotation that some people do bad things cathartically, trying to get rid of these bad feelings, but it just means effectively to remove those bad feelings. And some people do various things. Maybe you pray. Prayer can be very cathartic. It can be very helpful to purge or cleanse negative feelings, feeling poorly about a situation perhaps. But the word katharos in the Greek, it was used for a number of reasons, obviously not exclusively in the Bible, but extra biblical material would use it in relation to dirty clothes which had been washed, a leper who had been cleansed, flour that's carefully sifted to remove lumps and contaminants, and beverages which had not been diluted. We have the age-old problem of putting ice in your drink. Makes it cold, but it also removes the flavor because it dilutes. Notice from all of these, while some of them do mean to be pure and to remain pure, they don't all affect the origin of the thing being pure. Obviously, dirty clothes which had been washed implies that they had gotten dirty. This was a big problem when I was young. My mom was taking me to church in the Presbyterian church, and I would get dressed up, and if you've ever seen a picture of it, I know my wife has, I should get it, but I had this just sweet red suit. It was bright red, and I loved it, and I wore it all the time I possibly could, oftentimes coming down, wanting to go to school in it. And my mother, of course, said, "No! Those are clothes that are specifically for one purpose." They were church clothes. You probably may have grown up that way as well. And she didn't want me to get them dirty. She wanted them to remain pure, right? Perfect. And in fact, they were holy. Not in the traditional spiritual sense, but they were holy. They were set apart for a purpose. And you didn't get them dirty. But I did occasionally get sauce on them, lunch oftentimes. And so it doesn't just mean that something is perfect or remains perfect or has always been perfect, but more importantly that it can be perfect and that it is now perfected. Being pure in heart doesn't just mean to always be that way, but to become that way. What does it mean? In Proverbs chapter 6, there are times when the word pure obviously does not apply. Like in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19, where he says, "These 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, false witnesses who speak lies, and one who sows discord among brethren." No one would argue that these individuals are not pure of heart. And it's very obvious that this is not what Jesus is talking about when he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." More difficult to see are those who pretend at purity, like the Pharisees in Matthew 23. Many times Jesus, there in Matthew 23, calls them hypocrites. Scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, almost as if they are synonymous. And of course, after all of the verses that he does that very thing, perhaps they become synonymous. Maybe everyone who has heard him now say this so many times just associates those 3 words together, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. And in verse 25, notice he says, "Blind Pharisees, first cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish, that the outside of them may be clean also," he says. Because I just read verse 26. In verse 25 he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but the inside they are full of extortion, and self-indulgence. He would go on in 27 again, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness." They were very good at appearing righteous and holy externally. I'm not doing in any outward and obvious way something impure or unacceptable. And he says there in verse 28, "Even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." You are, and I can't get over this, you are like whitewashed sepulchres, tombs, burial chambers that you make pretty on the outside. We have some just down the road, in fact. And I sit in the cemetery sometimes, and I look at the tomb in the structure there, and it's really pretty, and it's got this really interesting thing written on the side. And some of these buildings are historical, and they have the history of the building and the people that are buried within. Sometimes even they have a history, not the one there I don't think, but sometimes they have a history of the people that are inside, or their bodies anyway, because the people are inside. But the bones that are inside and who they represent, and that's really interesting. But it's still filled with dead men's bones. And you can't get around that. And that's how he's comparing to these scribes, these Pharisees, these individuals who outwardly look righteous, he says to men, but inside they're filled with hypocrisy. They don't do the things that they say that people should do, but they still pretend. And it is difficult sometimes. It was difficult for the Israelites to reconcile, to see what was happening right in front of their eyes. But they still praised these men. They still considered them scribes, wise individuals, understanding in the law. And perhaps they were, but they weren't individuals who would apply it personally. And so they would create in themselves corruption. That's more difficult to see. It's easy for us to look at people who are obviously unrighteous, who are obviously doing bad things, but there are a lot of people out in the world who tend to purity, and it is difficult and perhaps impossible for us to determine. And that's one of the difficulties of making judgments, that we can't judge the intention. We have a difficult time understanding why a person would do such a thing. And they can have good intentions, or they can have poor intentions. Notice in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus goes on here from the Beatitudes to talk about how things begin in the inside. Bad things that happen on the outside start on the inside. He says there in verse 21, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.'" And that was true. And it's true today, legally, from our perspective, that if you commit murder, then there is a judgment to be had in relation to it. "But I say to you," he says, "that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whoever says to his brother, 'Eureka,' shall be in danger of the council, but whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire." Where does that desire to murder come from? But from within. But from the inward places of the person. And we must purify our hearts. That it's not just enough to purify our actions, though that's oftentimes how we present it. Just stop doing the things that you shouldn't be doing. And that's an easy thing relative to the much more difficult thing of purifying your heart, of not wanting to murder people to begin with. That's not always easy. And you say, "Well, Chris, how could you say that?" Well, really, I mean, you've been in this world. You've dealt with some of the people of this world. You know what I'm talking about. It is hard not to want to hurt somebody, even though you know you shouldn't hurt somebody. Now let's move beyond that to, I'm not just going to not hurt them, I'm not just going to not murder them, to, I'm going to work on not even wanting to murder them. I'm going to work on not wanting to hurt them. And he goes on, he says, as well, when it comes to adultery, verse 27, "You have heard that it was said of those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' And the Jews would say yes, and they'd say, 'Amen, that's true.' And many individuals would say, 'I've never committed adultery.' And they expect a pat on the back for that. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And all he's doing is effectively taking what they already knew, that they already weren't supposed to be doing and applying it to their inward self. That it's not enough for you just to not do it because you're not supposed to do it. Hey, let's move beyond this into not even wanting to do it. Let's move to that point where we don't even desire to commit adultery with another individual, that we desire not to do it in fact, that we move beyond that. Purity of heart is when one's life matches up with one's claim of being a Christian. Not just their life, but their attitude. Lines up with their actions. Their thoughts are constrained and consistent with His. And when I say His, I mean Christ. We need to become His in such a way that we move beyond the confines of merely not doing physically what we're not supposed to be doing, but we can move to a place where what we really desire most is to be His, is to live for Christ each and every day, and to put those things that are wrong and sinful, not only out of our life and our actions and out of our hands, but out of our hearts. Remember there, the psalmist there in Psalm 24, who can approach the house of God, who can approach His holy mountain, but those who have clean hands, their actions, and a pure heart, their inward motivation. We need to have both. Why do you want it? Why do you want it to be pure in heart? Well, he says here in Matthew chapter 5 that those are the ones who are going to see God. Now we can start there. That's a great place to start. Effectively saying, I want to go to heaven. And heaven is a great reason to do something. Wanting to be with God forever in this utopia, in this amazing place. In 1 John chapter 2 and 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2, he says, Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be, but we know that when He is revealed, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. There's a lot of questions I have for Jesus, for God. And we discussed it a lot, my wife and I. Am I going to care if/when I go to heaven? No. I don't think so. But it's interesting to think about it now. And now is the time I'm thinking about it. So it's a time for me to put all those questions in priority. To find out what I can about what I don't know yet. But then to lay on Jesus the things that I am not aware of, the things that I don't know, and things I really wonder about. If nothing else, it helps me to get over the fact that I don't know. I say something silly like, well, I'll ask Jesus when I get there. And suddenly that issue that I'm having and that thought that I'm wondering about, that doesn't bother me so much anymore, because if I do care, if it matters enough when I get there, then I'll ask. Being pure in heart, why do I want to be? Because I want to be with Jesus. Because I want to be with God. And it's the very thing that Jesus says in John chapter 14 and verse 6. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. I don't see any loopholes there. I don't see any alternative ways. He says, I am the way. And while the word the is important in English, it's far more important in Greek and other languages that are concrete. The English language is not as concrete as we'd like it to be, especially how we use it, which is ridiculous. But when you say the, it's a definitive. It means it's the only, effectively. He didn't say, I am a way, a truth, and a life. But I am the only. You could effectively add only there, and it would be as proper and as effective. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There is no other way. Additionally, in Proverbs chapter 4, Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. He says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. And if we were to stop there, that's enough for me right there. What are the issues of life? Everything that comes out of me comes from my heart. It's what Jesus was just saying in Matthew 5. Out of it springs forth the issues of life. Every problem that I have is inward. Now, we might look out into the world. We have a temptation to blame other people for making us upset or angry, making us fearful. But those emotions are ours, and we've got to own them. If someone makes me so angry that I say things that I shouldn't say, that's a me problem, not a them problem. That's an issue with me controlling what is inside of me. Would I like them to be different? Would I like that to not happen? Sure. But if they can push my buttons to the degree that I will strike them, that I will do something I shouldn't do, or they can intimidate me, or they can make me feel bad about myself, that's a me problem, not a them problem. I've got to have control of me, because within the heart contains all the issues of my life. And if I can control this thing inside of me, if I control my actions through my thoughts and my motivations and the intents of my heart, then I have control of what is most important. I have control of my future. Not just in this life, though that is certainly the case. I have seen many people who have failed epically because they did not control themselves, because they were pushed and prodded through peer pressure, through intimidation, in order to do things that they ought not do. And it ruined their physical life. But more importantly, my spiritual life is mine. And no one can separate me from the love of Christ Jesus. No one can separate me from God. That's what Paul argues in Romans chapter 8, verses 32 through 40. That no matter what I go through, tribulation or persecution or nakedness or peril, distress, the sword, they say, well, no one hears this anymore, but they held a sword to my throat. When was the last time that happened to you? The odds of that are very slim. But even if it happened, did they force you to do it? Or did you choose to do it? The Proverbs writer, Jesus, Paul would argue, you did it. You chose to do that. Because you considered the consequence of their actions greater than the consequences of your actions in relation to your God. And that was a bad decision. He says, for out of it springs the issues of life. Verse 24, put away from you a deceitful mouth. There's a word we traditionally see, especially in Paul's writings, the word therefore. But it's practically there. He says, for out of it spring the issues of life. Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put perverse lips far from you. Let your eyes look straight ahead, and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or the left, or move your foot from evil. You ever been walking on the street, and people weren't paying attention to where they were going? It's usually because of this. They got their cell phone out, and they're texting somebody, and they're trying to walk at the same time. Now, while you should never text and drive, you really ought not walk and text either. You run into people, and you know why? Because you're not looking where you're going. And in this life, that will get you into trouble. That will get you walking into traffic. That will get you in physical harm. Now, if we're not spiritually watching where we're going, if we get tossed around like every wind, into every wind of doctrine, like a child, the Hebrews writer warns against, then we've got real problems. Then we are not in control of our actions, or our attitudes, our inward man, or our outward man at that point. We need to want to be pure of heart, not only because we would really like to see God, but because we would really like to have some control over this life. And the only thing I can control in this life is me. I don't control other people. I don't control God's will. I don't control the weather, obviously, or it'd be a lot nicer than it is today. I don't control anything except for me. And if I refuse to correct and to maintain my control over me, then I have absolutely no control. And I'm in a spiral. And I'm going to places that I ought not go, and I'm going to a place that God doesn't even want me to go. He doesn't want me going to hell. He's done all these things in order to keep me from going to hell. But effectively and inevitably, I choose where I go. And so do you. No one will go to hell accidentally. No one will get into heaven accidentally. It is a choice that we make. Why do we want to be pure in heart? Because this life is a lot easier if we are. This life becomes a lot more manageable if we can maintain it. There's also the simplicity of life that a Christian can enjoy. Many people envy that simplicity. There are a lot of people who have either come up to me or I've heard stories of others coming up to them, and they talk about how the drama of this world is just a mess. That it's a pain to have to manage But an honest, sincere person does not have to keep straight the lies that they have told, nor to maintain a distance between their wife and their mistress. You know, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about what lies I told who and how to keep them straight. You just stop lying to people. You tell the truth. And life becomes a lot more simple and a lot more enjoyable when I don't have to worry of looking over my shoulder all the time. And I get people that come to me and they say, wow, man, that sounds really nice. I wish I could do that. And you can do that. Not only spiritually, but you can do it physically if you want. Many people are realizing that. The logic and the reason behind the way God has designed us to live works for everyone. Not just for the Christian. It doesn't work spiritually for anyone but the Christian. But it works in this world. It works in this life when people trust you. When people know that you're sincere and honest. Now, they might not appreciate it at first, but they'll learn what questions to ask. And they might get upset a few times because you're honest with them. But usually, they're reasonable enough to know that you were just honest with them. And they'll learn to appreciate that. And it'll change the way people see you. Now, the real question isn't what does it mean or why do we want it, but how do we get it? How do we get a purity of heart? Because it doesn't come naturally, I'll tell you that right now. We might start pure, perfect, unblemished as children, babies. The world corrupts. The world dilutes. It makes us dirty. It brings in contaminants. And so we've got to wise up. And we've got to clean up. And we've got to give up. And we've got to take up. And we've got to receive up. We've got to wise up. We've got to come to the conclusion that this world does not work the way that it describes it working. This world is a mess. It's a dumpster fire. And really, the fire is coming. The cleansing fire of the end of this world is on its way. Do we want to be caught up in that dumpster fire? Do we want to work out around it? In Acts chapter 17, Paul warns those on the Areopagus, these philosophers and these individuals who were really curious about all new things under the sun and who had thought and hadn't really come to any concrete conclusion about the meaning of life or the purpose of this world. He says there in chapter 17 and verse 26, he says, "And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." But he doesn't just do that for the fun. He doesn't just do that because he likes pushing people around or getting his way. In fact, God doesn't always get his way. Because we're told in the New Testament, for everyone to be saved. So he certainly does not get his way in that. In verse 27, he gives you the reason why God has done all these things and why he has such control over the world. He says, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. We got to wise up that the way we've been doing things is not the way it should be done. That God's way is the way it should be done and is going to bring us to prosperity, is going to bring us to spirituality, is going to bring us to the place where we need to be. We talked about that as being poor in spirit, mourning, and being meek. We got to be people who wisen up to the fact that the way we've been doing things isn't the way we ought to be doing things. We got to clean up. We got to quit being phony. That's a hard thing. A hard thing for us to take the mask off and to let people see us for who we really are. All the imperfections and all the difficulties. Now, I don't wear makeup. But if I did, I imagine it'd be difficult for me to stop wearing makeup. If I felt so compelled to cover up the blemishes and the problems, I imagine it'd be hard to stop. It's hard to stop pretending. It's hard to be honest with people. But it's necessary. It's necessary that we clean up our lives, that we quit being phony. And as you see in Acts chapter 19 and verse 19, we got to get rid of the things that are holding us back. We got to burden them sometimes, even at great cost to ourselves. He says there in verse 19, also many of those who had practiced magics brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all, and they counted up the value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. That is an incredible sacrifice they're making. But really, the sacrifice is not theirs. They had spent their proceeds, the money, before they become Christians on these ridiculous tomes of magics and books that talked about things that they ought not be a part of. And only after they realized it, they decide that we can't even sell them back. Not even for good reason, not even to do some religious thing. But it's not appropriate for us to sell these ill-gotten gains, these awful things. And notice what happens, verse 20. What happens when these people make this kind of decision? What happens when we give up the sins in our lives and we put first the kingdom of God and His righteousness? He says, so the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. There were people that weren't just impressed with the amount, but were impressed with what they were doing, that they were committing themselves to something greater, to something different, something challenging. And they were cutting off entirely that part of their life that they were formerly a part of that they had not been. That is not an easy thing to do either. We're going to be people who put God first and who clean up our lives in relation to it. We've got to be people who give up. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 25, he says, whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, until your will is God's way, you don't get your way. The trick is to get your way to line up with God's way, not the other way around. But to get your way to line up with God's way, then guess what? Then you always get your way. If what I really want to do is share the gospel, then I am happy every time I do so. Then I get my way. Then I get to share the gospel instead of I have to share the gospel. See the difference? It seems like a subtle difference, but it's more than just a subtle difference. It's a major difference. When our desires do not line up with God's desires, we are at odds. And that's when we feel the most ostracized from Him. That's when we feel like He's a bad parent who just wants us to do His will because He wants us to do it. But when we see the truth of God's will, and we recognize how it is good for us and best in our interests, then it's not hard for us to line up our will with His. And so we must give our heart to Him. We must take up our cross. Luke chapter 9, verse 23, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. We've got to get to work. We've got to get moving. It's not enough for us to say, yes, I'd really like my life to change. I'd really like to clean up my life, and I'd like to get rid of all these bad things. I've said that about my garage a few times. And you know what doesn't happen? When you say that, stuff doesn't just start happening. I mean, this isn't Mary Poppins where you sing a song and all the toys go back in the toy box. There's no magic spell like in Fantasia where the broom gets up and sweeps the floor itself. You got to do it. If you want things to change, you got to start changing them. And you got to get to work. We've got to be individuals who are willing to take up that cross. Because that cross, it can be heavy at times. But it's always worth carrying. It's always worth carrying. So we've got to wise up, we've got to clean up, we've got to give up, we've got to take up, and then we've got to receive up. Because purity of heart doesn't come solely from us. You can't do enough to purify your heart. You can't do enough on your own to make your soul redeemed. In fact, what you must do is receive from the Lord, because it is impossible to be pure without Him. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, he says, since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. You can only love one another fervently with a pure heart because, he says, since you have purified your soul in obeying the truth. How do you receive purity? How do you become pure? By being purified by the one who is Himself pure. You ever tried to take dirty water and wash your hands? It doesn't do very well. You need some pure water. You need some water that's not contaminated. You got to receive the offer that Jesus has given us. Accept what God has offered. You got to purify yourself in obeying the gospel, believing the word, repenting of your sins, confessing Christ, and being baptized in Him, that you might be cleansed of your sins and be made holy, be made pure. But again, that's itself not enough. We must accept what God has offered and continue in that purity. That initial purity is only something that must be continued, that must be engendered, that must be developed. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, "And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he, God, is pure." Everyone who has this hope, if we truly want what God is offering, if we truly want to be purified and perfected, if we want to go to heaven, to see Him, if we want this life to be simpler, if not easier, if we want all the things that God has for us and has offered us through His will, we want to receive His promises, we've got to receive them through Jesus Christ. We've got to receive them according to the gospel, and we've got to obey it as it is written. Then we must accomplish it. And He has encouraged us and uplifted us to do so. He has enabled us to be His, to be purified and perfected if we so desire. And if you desire today to be washed and redeemed in baptism, or to come back to Him because you've walked down that wayward path, and you've given up on the hope that is in Him, or if you need the prayers, the help of the congregation to be more perfect and more pure, to purify your thoughts, your hearts, you need help and encouragement to keep going, we are here for you to help you through difficulties, to bring you through to the end. And whatever you need, I pray that you would let me know as to go and stand.